Krishnan, Usha, Raman, and Sita, onto this stage. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce our moderator, Sita Reddy. She's a writer, scholar, and she is the visiting professor at University of Hyderabad. She's also a visiting fellow at the Smithsonian and Sangam House. Over to you. A couple of logistics. The session will be 35 to 40 minutes, and after that, for 10 minutes for Q&A, and our volunteers are available. They will come to you with the mic, and you can ask your question. Thank you. Over to you, Sita.
Thank you. Good morning, good Sunday morning to all of you. You are in a session titled Longing, Belonging, and Writing Home. It's in Orwell 1. So if you're looking for that, this is the right place. It is my absolute privilege and honor to introduce debut works and authors of a novel and a set of short stories, one by a good friend and a writing buddy who we kind of forged bonds over the pandemic, actually. And so that's a very special bond for reading and writing buddies. And someone I just met an hour ago, but a new friend. I'm going to run through these introductions and sort of do a short version. Usha Raman is a professor of media and communications in the University of Hyderabad at SN School. Many colleagues are here, who writes across genres of feminism, health communication, and journalist pedagogy, and digital cultures too. And this is her debut novel, published by B Books, 2024. Jay, I'm going to call you Jay because you gave me permission, a startup entrepreneur with an electrical engineering and management background. And he has a 20-year career founding multiple entrepreneurial ventures in India, around the world, across Bangalore, Boston, Hyderabad, Silicon Valley, and Waterloo. And interestingly, he was first CEO of Tea Hub in India as long ago as 2014, which is sort of one of the venues of the festival. And currently the CEO at Accelerator Center in Canada. And this is his first book of stories published by Adi Sakrit Publishing in 2023, right? So these are very different books. Usha's, as I see it, is a quiet, multi-generational novel of the relationship between mothers and daughters. There are male characters in it, and they're very nice, well drawn out male characters, but they're peripheral to the story and the action. And the focus is their interior lives within the context of the family. Spoiler alert, I have Usha's permission for this. If I have to do one of those publishing, this is like a description of the book, I would call it a fine balance meets monsoon wedding, because there is action. There's a lot of it is the interior lives of people, and sometimes nothing happens until it does. Jay's book of 12 auto-fictional short stories, autobiographical fictional short stories, is each based on a true event. You call it a bead in the necklace of my experiences, right? And maybe we can talk about that a little later. So rather than force commonalities between them, what I thought I'd do was discuss their differences across 4 or 5 themes that are core concepts for creative writing. Story and form, place and memory, person, which includes voice, character, plot, which has the dramatic arc of the works, and process. And we'll get to that in a bit. But what I thought I wanted to begin with was the titles, because here I did see a common thread. Polite conversations and unfinished business. Both refer in different ways to what's hidden, unseen, unsaid, incomplete. And partial knowledge is, as we know, as writers know and readers know, is sort of part of like what we have control over. You can pace it, you can give characters certain voice at certain moments, and the plot comes out in that way. Silence is a very big part of your book, Usha. You have this line that says, sometimes silence is the only language you have. And for you, Jay, unfinished business, like a business or a project or a life, may always seem unfinished until examined. I'm thinking of the Socratic idea of the examined life. And how does one write a life like this? Is it impolitely or retrospectively in your case? Can you each speak about your titles, what it's code for, and through the title, your impulse for writing the book? So sort of like the origin story, as a favorite podcast of ours keeps going on about. But let me kick things off by adding a little bit about the session title. Longing and belonging were given to us. But for me, both of your works have that sense of nostalgia. And you mentioned nostalgia a lot. And nostos plus algos, the Greek word nostalgia, is sort of really about the pain and the longing of returning home. So sort of like the presence of absence. So it's involved in the writing one's way home. It's involved in the writing away from home as an expat, as a migrant, as a sojourner, as a foreigner, and a returnee. We were talking about being returnees. And I added the writing home because I haven't been able to get this out of my head. Usha and I both heard a lecture, a talk at the University of Hyderabad by Nilima Sheikh, the artist, who just gave an amazing lecture. And the title of her talk was Of Loss, Pain and Healing in Search of a Lexicon. So it sort of like gave you a sense of how the pain gave you the language in order to kind of like, her latest work was called Carrying a Cross, Leaving Behind. And she left us with this image of, borrowed from the Pahadi painter Nayan Suk, of a kingdom on a boat, that you're always carrying things with you and leaving things behind. So there were traces and palimpsests. So with that in mind, Usha, maybe I'll turn to you first. Why polite conversations? I see silence as a narrative device in your book. What happens in families when silence is broken?
A little bit about the title. So actually the original title was, in something that seems trite now, which was Longing and Belonging. And then my daughters shot it down. They said that's just too cheesy. And so then I used Polite Conversations, which also they didn't like. And but then the publisher liked, so we kept that. And it's kind of grown on me because I think families, particularly Indian families, were always taught to be polite, to be respectful. And that is the grammar of the household. And a household that schools impoliteness out of its children is the ideal one, right? So, but then what ends up happening is that to have polite conversations, you have to have silences, because what cannot be polite has to be silenced. And I think, so therefore, for a conversation or for conversations that happen across lifetimes, if they are to remain polite, they cannot do without silence. So I think, so silence is extremely important. But then what happens in families with polite conversations is that they disguise, these conversations often disguise and cover up toxicity. And so toxicity is something now as a culture we're beginning to acknowledge and verbalize in many ways. But I think for generations, that was not even an idea, right? I mean, how can a family even be toxic, right? So I think, I mean, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here in terms of the theme, but polite conversations is really a polite title, which is meant to signal that not all conversations should be or are polite. Yeah.
And Jay, with unfinished business, which is the name of the titular, the first story in your collection. Why in 2023 did you want to go back to a character who you wanted to write about from your Bangalore college years? Was there a reason? So going back, what's unfinished there?
Yeah. So firstly, happy, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Happy Republic Day. And thank you all for being here. I was telling my 13-year-old daughter last night, to get up on a Sunday morning to show up at a panel is very endearing for authors, at least for me as a first-time author. So thank you for that. But as far as the question goes, I think the simplicity of the title came from the idea that I didn't have to think too much about it, anchored on two sentiments. One, I think one goes through multiple chapters in one's life where you begin to realize that there's a set of things I set out to do in my 20s, and in my 30s you go through reconciliation, in your 40s you begin to optimize based on where you are, in your 50s I suppose you optimize for, thank you, for the runway that's ahead of you, right? So unfinished business is a sentiment that I think every individual carries as you traverse through life. But going back to why I touched upon the topic of an era from my college days 20 years ago, largely stemmed from the second sentiment of the chaos that exists in a fabric like India. We thrive in the chaos. Right? For folks who've been exposed to the West and have come back from the West, there is a semblance of a script that you stick to in the West, which becomes mundane. And in India, you thrive in the chaos. Without the chaos, I wonder if we'll be where we are. An unfinished business takes a chapter out of that chaos that existed 20 years ago, and you look at life now and you go, well, there is still unfinished business. And that particular story, without giving it away, this is my 2-second pitch on please go buy the book. It's available, both of us actually. Dwells into the aspect of what a college kid goes through when you hit the first revelation of this crazy chaos. And then a reflection of it in my 40s when I wrote the book, that you start to embrace that chaos and appreciate it.
So you self-define, or I think in the preface, the Setu, who writes the preface for you, calls it autofiction, right? So I want to turn to a question about when I asked both of you for your writing inspirations, you gave me authors who write in literary realism, realist fiction, realist short stories for you, Usha. Usha's list included Rohinton Mistry, Bapsi Sidhwa, Anne Patchett,
Many others.
Kamala
Kamala
Shamsi, and Shiv Shankar, who I didn't really know about, but who writes about Tamil. And you gave me, in your list were Chekhov, Bradbury, I think Ray Bradbury, O. Henry, H.H. Munro, who goes by the name Saki. Also a realist novels and novel writers, and realist short stories. What, if we kind of think about fiction as the etymology of fiction actually has roots which are related to figment and feign. So not necessarily factually inaccurate, not that meaning, but the meaning that goes along with invented, contrived actually is the word that the dictionary gives us. In your sense, what's the relationship of realist fiction writing with accuracy. And I say this because each of you does it very differently. I think Usha spends a lot of time and she has a near ethnographic eye for detail. This is high compliment to you. I am an ethnographer. And very observational. And I think part of it has to do with what you say you wanted to write, which was the novel of the everyday, the mundane. But you also, maybe I can begin with you, Usha. You told me a funny story about getting your aunt telling you that you got the food menu or the tambram, filter coffee rituals, that aspect of it exactly right. And maybe I forgot the exact thing, but it had a lot to do with where the cashews are placed and the raisins are placed in the chakrapoi. So do you want to speak a little bit about that relationship between realism and that observational eye that you have, and how to get it right, a certain setting, what writers call the situation, not the story, but the situation.
Yeah, well, I think, it helps that I'm trained as a journalist, and so there is a lot of cachet placed on, noticing things and getting the truth of the situation right. So I think, I'm trying to think how to answer your question in non-academic ways. But I think part of writing is conjuring up the everyday. Of course, we all build worlds, right? So those of you who read fantasy or science fiction know that a lot of pre-writing work goes into building the world and the detail and the logic of it and all that. But when you're writing realist fiction, I think the kind of world you build is a known world, or what we think is known. And then it's in the writing of it that you realize that a lot of the known is actually not that known. And it's only in drawing on or making your mind sort of focus on, how do you pull the dabra and tumbler out of the shelf? How do you make the coffee? How much of the coffee grounds do you put in? And all of these things are so particular to individuals. And they also say a lot about individuals. So I think, when you make your mind sort of dwell on those details, and then you start seeing things that you had not noticed, as you live life. And I think part of the joy of writing also is to recall those details and to create that texture of the everyday. But then the danger also is that if you're writing realist fiction, and if you're writing from your own context, the danger is everybody's trying to read your life into it. And which has happened with my novel. I mean, everybody in my family who's read it has said, so we can see so-and-so, and who's this, and and I have to tell them this is fiction. Yes, the context is real, and the details make the context real, but that doesn't mean the characters are real. So I don't know if I've answered your question completely. But
you have, and actually I did ask you this too, because I saw a lot of you in Kaveri, but then Usha, being Usha and very diligent, said, but you didn't notice, I actually made her a few years older than I did. But anyway. And Jay, so sort of a similar question to you about how, when you were writing, I think you were talking about a particular, which one was it? Maybe in the story called The Loss. Which you, I think, had told me that sort of changed the momentum of the narrative of the book, but it also reflected the change in the pace of your life. So could you tell us a little bit about Loss, and maybe read, if we have time, read a little bit about it?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I just want to tee off from what Usha said. Right? So in my case, these are short stories with the auto-fiction genre, and 2 centimeters in, and this thing is going to be in my mouth, right?
Yeah.
The idea behind the inspiration of autofiction, in my case, has a very contrarian view. Everything in the book, in all the stories, are real. All the characters are real. And I had to pay a little bit of attention to ensuring that there is a sense of vulnerability that people who read it can relate to, but at the same time, identities, if you will, are not compromised. So I had to find that balance, but a lot of it is real. There are wrappers of, I'd say, embellishment of sentiments, if you will, that I've tried to exemplify through the story.
I think it's the angle at which you hold it.
Does that make it any better? Oh, thank you. Hopefully, oh wow. Good thing that I haven't put any of you to sleep so far. Yeah, I can hear myself now. Yeah, I think we can toggle. Thank you. Yeah, so I think the universality of the sentiments in the stories truly comes from the characters and the sentiments all being real. And I've tried to shroud the layers of human emotions through the embellishment, right? So Loss particularly is a story that was very pivotal, looking back at it in the journey of my own life. I was in my 30s, and I was in the US, and I'd gone through a very pivotal moment in terms of life and life experience. So happy to read a passage, and I'll keep it short. I'll try to at least.
I think you said from the beginning of the story, right?
I'll pick a piece in between, I think, and this touches upon. So just to set context, right? Loss is a story which is in New York, and I've gone through a fair amount of introspection, from being an absolutely arrogant prick to reflecting back on what led me to that. This is another way of saying I'm no longer arrogant, and therein lies the fallacy of lack of humility. But that's a different topic for another day, I guess. So yeah, let me pick a passage that reflects that moment. Okay. So this is a moment where I'm dealing with a relationship, and quite like everything else in life, you're conflicted with reality that goes on in your head, which could be far from the reality that's outside your head. Okay, so here we go. She turned on the light, and I noticed that she was all dressed to go out. She had her war paint on in the form of her makeup. She had changed into a frilly summer skirt, revealing her legs and her shoddy feet that eons ago had the luxury of a pedicure. The shirt that she wore seemed crumpled and faded, and I noticed the conspicuous hair bangs that I had failed to notice earlier that evening. It was amazing how a beauteous creature, in a matter of almost an hour, had transformed herself into an unattractive entity, all in the confines of my own personal perception.
Thank you. Moving on to place, both your works span continents. Usha, your characters travel between Calgary, Hyderabad, Mumbai, and then she looks back to Bangalore. Jay, for you, is Boston, Bangalore, mostly, right? How in your writing do you work to evoke a place, Usha, and especially because memory is also, so there are three characters that Usha can maybe speak about a little when she responds. Parvati, the grandmother, Kaveri, her daughter, and Kaveri's daughter, Aparna, who each live in different places. But because we're in Hyderabad, I was wondering if you could maybe read or speak a little bit about how you evoke the cityscapes and recognizable, areas. Because it was clear that her home was somewhere in Secunderabad, and you kind of clarified that. So could you do like the markers of place first, and then I want to follow up a question on memory of a place. Yeah, I think maybe.
So this is.
Sounds better. I think this might.
Yes, all of this has to go into a novel, right? I have lived in Hyderabad all my life. I was born here, as was my father, and so the city occupies you know, whether I love it or hate it, a huge part of my imagination and my everyday. And so initially, I mean, obviously the main character, Kaveri, is set in Hyderabad. But I spent a few years of my early childhood in Calgary with my parents in Canada. And I mean, I remember when Jhumpa Lahiri's namesake came out, and you know, the whole experience of being a young woman in a cold country, you know, going from Kolkata to Boston. I think that was very similar to what my mother experienced, going from Hyderabad, Chennai, or Bangalore to Calgary, and Calgary is like several degrees colder than Boston. So I remember in my bones how that felt. And of course, I was very young when we came back, so I don't have very clear recollections, and my recollections perhaps we'll answer in the next question on memory. But I think how you feel, how you remember, all of that has to do with place. And for me, of course, Hyderabad is the main place where a lot of the novel unfolds. But Canada also plays a big role in it. Of course, you know, what I remember of Canada is very hazy, but Hyderabad is every day. And also, I've seen the city change so much. And it was important for me to locate the novel in a part of Hyderabad, and I don't think this was conscious, it just happened, in a part of Hyderabad that Hyderabadis will recognize. I'm not sure those who live in this part of the city will so easily recognize those locations. So it is, of course, Maritpalli, it is the Tarband area where there are still a few old Parsi homes. There is Naubat Pahad, you know, Nandini will know that area very well. But Naubat Pahad also is no longer Naubat Pahad, right? Tangband, Hussain Sagar Lake, which didn't have the statues when I was growing up. So these are places that I've recalled. And again, they're not named so much as evoked. And I think people who live in Hyderabad will recognize those places. And there is a little bit of lament for change. I mean, I think all of us who live in Hyderabad, you know, do have that, although we're doing this in this part of the city, and you have to also recognize the infrastructure that brings. So for me, the place is, of course, emotional, but it's also political in a way, to think about those places in specific ways.
No, that's interesting. Yes, they were not named. Nothing was named. And in fact, I went back and looked. Time markers were also, I had to search for it. I knew where I was, but there wasn't any specific reference. So, but just a follow-up thing on memory, because memory is such a big part of the novel. You say somewhere memory is the doppelganger of forgetting. And I see two kinds of memory operating in the novel. One is, let's say, when Parvati is remembering her time in Canada. And when she goes to Canada, when you first introduce the character, she's, of course, thinking of the music and what she misses in Bangalore. So that's happening. There's that gentle, nostalgic memory. But there's also the violent, cataclysmic memory of that goes along with the silence, the other side of silence. Would you like to read a little bit here, or shall we wait till we introduce Parvati a little later? Yeah? So about place. You mark place too. There were blackberries, and I knew exactly what was happening then, or when it was. You do it a lot with cars and material culture. I'm a car klutz, and but I understood what you were kind of signaling with the Passat or whatever it is, including class. Could you speak? I was thinking about your story, Kolkata, that is about a place and sort of where facts and reality kind of clash in a time of crisis. Would you like to read a little bit of it, or like place it a little bit for us, and then read a tiny little snippet? Yeah.
Absolutely. No, thank you. You know, I must say, I sit on many panels, but hats off to you for your own memory. The fact that you were able to recollect both our favorite writers. So kudos to you. But as far as the question goes, Kolkata is a story where in my own head I'm dealing with the dilemma of being an individual that thinks very logically. I mean, I deal with startups every day. I'm a tech nerd. And synthesizing everything that you've learned about a cataclysmic event that is about to unfold. And that conflicts with the emotional sentiment that kicks in when that event has actually happened. So, just to set context, this is a point in time in the city of Calcutta, or Kolkata, where I've taken my then 3-year-old daughter, and it's in the middle of the Ramakrishna Mutt, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of humans there. And I'm dealing with the fear of losing the child, and this fabulous piece of scientific literature that I've read about when you lose a child, what is it that you do? And it deals with concentric circles. The probability of finding the child diminishes significantly as the concentric circles get wider. So the trick is to run to the gate and not look. So that's in my head, and I haven't lost the child, but I'm dealing with the propensity of that eventuality. So I'll just read a line. She had tiny little buckles on her shoes that needed to be undone. I bent over and started unbuckling them. All of a sudden, I was aware that her life was confined to her height. Her entire sense of the world was a perception of events at an altitude of 3 feet. And everything at 3 feet looks intimidating. At this very moment, on my bent knee, at her height, I could see there were thousands and thousands of adult legs around me. It was humbling. And I'll just wrap that up with the sentence that follows in the following paragraph. I let go of Tamara's hand and looked down for less than a second. I could sense her tiny hand clutching, leaning onto my shoulder. In a split second of the chaos of the crowd that seemed to intensify, the noise, the jostling, and the disorienting atmosphere, I felt that grip on my shoulder slip away. I looked up, and she was gone.
Wonderful. And a little shout out here. This is Tamara, aged 12, 13 now. And she was 3 then. Let's move quickly to characters and voice. You both use third person mostly. Jay, there are only 2 stories in which you use first person. We were talking about it this morning. So this may be more relevant for the novel, for Usha's novel, than a short story. So I'll start with you, Usha. There are 3 main perspectives, as I see it. The 3 women with rotating narratives, right? They lead chapters. And you said somewhere, I asked you about this, as the primary narrator is Kaveri, or the perspective. But you said you were not invested in her. I see Aparna as the conscience, the daughter, and Parvati as sort of like the synthesizer, like a Greek chorus. When when Kaveri, finds this new love interest, she kind of like she reflects it in some way, or almost sanctions it in her own life or relates to it. Do you like your characters equally? I love Parvati, her gentle humor, her groundedness. I was wondering if we have a little time, if you could talk a little bit about her or your favorite part. You said your favorite part of the novel was when you introduced Parvati. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, this was a criticism actually that a friend, an early reader, made, that I like my characters too much. And maybe that's true, and maybe it's also, I'm thinking, and this is a little out of syllabus, but it's also that when you're writing a realist novel, you want, and maybe it's reflective of the title and my own socialization, that you want to have nice people around you. So you build nice people. And there are no, 100% nice people. But so it's difficult to maintain that tension that you need to create with someone who's not nice to make the novel interesting, right? I mean, nice people maybe are not that interesting. So, yeah. But so I mean, obviously Kaveri is the main narrator, and it is her story along which the other characters hang their experiences. Um, but I think Parvati is a more interesting character, and perhaps her interiority could have been explored more. And one of my friends who read the book early on also said that the older sister, Meera, is a really interesting character, and she could have been developed more. But then that's true of all books, right? You have all these characters, and you have to choose who gets to speak. So Parvati, I think, is an interesting figure because she represents, um, definitely this traveling across time, but also across space, and having to accommodate newness, and doing it in a way that is graceful, perhaps, but not without conflict. So yeah, that's how I read her. And I think Aparna was the most problematic for me because, again, that is a generation that I constantly interact with in my teaching, and of course with my children. But it's also a generation that is living in such a new world. And especially when I'm teaching, I find that, our realities are so different. The way we have to modulate our aspirations are so different. The vocabularies that are available to us are so different. And so how does one understand that and occupy that character? So I think there were different kinds of challenges with each. Would you like me to read the piece where I introduce?
Maybe just a little bit. And you also do, I like what you do in terms of the italics. You have, that's the thought, and some incoming texts come in, like the Sherlock series.
Yeah, actually, a lot of the novel is interior dialogue or monologue, and some parts of it are where the character is responding to an immediate situation, and some is like where she goes into the past. But I'll just read a little bit about Parvati. And the chapter actually begins with her going back to a memory in her hometown of Tiruchirappalli. But she's thinking now at the point where she hears about her son-in-law's passing. And so this is how I describe her. Parvati's slim frame, tall and slightly stooped, lifted itself out of the cane armchair and carried her weary 86-year-old body to the window, to look down with still sharp eyes on the sparse greenery below. Sometimes it happened that her body did things of its own accord, surprising her mind and her heart with an agility that belied its age. But most of the time, it was the other way around. Her mind raced ahead with the eagerness of youth, her heart skipped a beat when confronted by surprise or excitement, her emotions still, on occasion, bothered her with their intensity. But her body stayed still and unyielding, stopped by arthritic pain and plain old tiredness from responding in ways that now belonged to memory.
Lovely. And Jay, can I sort of ask you to speed read a little bit, maybe the end of Dear Diary? Is that the first person? Yeah, but in the interest of time, kind of, so that we...
So Dear Diary is reflective, I would say an essay on where I was in life, and this was very centripetal to the life that I was leading, which had three moments converging. One, my own startup life, which is very pregnant with the possibility of a failure or a takeoff. The second was the death of my grandmother, and the third was my wife Lakshmi, who was pregnant at that time. So it was trying to find a balance between these multiple sentiments that I was going through. Okay, let's see. I mentally handled an ensuing argument in my head. Sorry. With a conscious decision to keep Lakshmi cheerful, given her condition, I bit my lip and told her what I wanted her to think, as opposed to what I was actually thinking. I responded solemnly, "Babe, you know the situation. I had to increase our liabilities on the book. Sharma didn't give me much choice. I put a house down as collateral and took more money down. I think it will all be okay." Little
Thank
did
you.
I know what was to come.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes. I think we should wrap up. I had a question that if no one has, I want to put out there that is about trauma fiction and the trauma plot, but that can wait. Maybe we can turn it over to the audience now. Both these books, fine books, are available at the bookstore. So yeah, anyone?
Yeah, Usha, congratulations on the debut novel. Hopefully, we don't have to wait this long for the next one. I know it's been in the making for a while. The word interior kept cropping up in both of your comments about the book, and I found that too. And possibly, it is the interiority of the novel that makes it so absorbing that readers get into the intimate lives of these three generations of family. But I was also wondering whether it was a conscious decision to keep the exterior out, because the exterior makes only fleeting appearances here and there. There is the emergency that comes in, there is the institutional politics in Aparna's institute. So being a social scientist, one is always talking about context. And I was wondering whether it was a conscious decision to do that, or it just so happened you are focusing so much on interiority, you didn't think that the exterior was so important.
That's a really interesting point, and I think you'll have to wait for my second novel. That is all about context. But I think because of the nature of the story and the nature of the narrative, it was really about why conversations don't get impolite, because you're thinking so much, and all your responses are so considered before you actually allow them to emerge. And so, yeah, of course, context is important, and perhaps the few occasions where the context appears is also is particularly the institutional politics, right? That is actually a catalytic moment for Aparna to discover something and verbalize something. So obviously context matters, but in this novel, I felt that it was more about the internal responses, which keep conversations from happening.
Just to add to that, we were at, you moderated the session with Anita Nair, and she was talking about the importance of, she begins with the social commentary. So it's not necessarily the exterior, but begins with the problem she's trying to not solve, but at least depict, and then has that give inputs to the character. So I think, in a way, the exterior in Usha's novel is subtle. You really had to pay attention to, but not political. Everything is political, but there weren't political events that were, I think.
Hello. My question is for both of you. I haven't read the books, but what I understood from the session is that both of you evoke a different time and place from the past, right? So I want to ask, during the writing, did you struggle with information dumping in order to, bring that place and time, like with cultural aspects or archaeological, anything?
One of the problems was that my novel took a very long time to write, simply because I have a day job and I was writing in whatever space and time was available in between. In fact, there were times when I would write, 200 words written today, 500 words written today. But so there is change that happens in context as your story develops, and suddenly, actually now, there's a piece there's a little exchange in the book which happens on old feature phones, where you had to use SMS language. And now I'm thinking, this exchange is completely out of sync with the way people use phones now, right? So yes, time. So I did not have to contend with information dump because mine is not that kind of a novel. But maybe Jay has more to say.
Yeah, I had three challenges specifically. It's a great question, by the way. Challenge number one is the format of short stories. I'd read somewhere that the best way to describe a short story is the perception of life as seen through a raindrop and the ability to condense it down. So that was a challenge to your point, to your question. The second challenge I had was how open do you make the book? In the book, in the stories that the book translates or transliterates. And the third challenge I had, going back to Usha's point, was finding these flow states. So I started this thing during COVID. It was a period of lull after that, and then you get into this flow state and you cannot stop writing. So those were the three boundary conditions that I dealt with.
Yeah, I think both of you deal with the issue that I research, which is reverse migration, in different ways. And I have read Usha's novel and I haven't read yours. So I just want you to, I think Usha does the movements between places that seem very seamless, whereas the research shows a lot of rupture and disjuncture in that sense. So, yeah, I don't have more time. So that's what was puzzling me.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it, not as an author, but it does translate into my life as an author, right? Which is very short-lived. I think the gravity of India, at least given what I do in the startup world, is undeniable. There exist moments in time where there have been waves of the euphoria that you see in India because of macroeconomic growth, the overall sentiments, the ideas that come from the ground floor. So the gravity of India, to me, was undeniable enough that I've made this journey out to the West and come back twice now. And therefore, my stories also have a sense of the longing to go back, right? There's a phrase, and I'll drop it in the context of being politically incorrect. There's a phrase which people might have heard. It's a derogatory term called ABCD, American Born Confused Desi. I take pride in this term that I coined for myself and a bunch of my peers called DCBA. Desi is confused by America. I think my stories come from there.
Yeah, just very quickly. Actually, I think that that rupture and that difficulty also has changed over generations, right? So when I came back as an 8-year-old, I actually don't remember having felt displaced. And I think it had a lot to do with the way my parents handled that return. And the world was also different. But when my children came back, they were around the same age. They were 8 and 6. And my older daughter tells me now that she is, apparently she had huge issues of returning to India. And there were problems that she was not able to verbalize. And so we had never recognized. So I see that there is that rupture, but I think it varies, obviously. Yeah.
We have time for, I think, one, two.
I have this question for both of you. How do you grapple with self-critical voices inside of you while writing? When you probably feel that the writing is not matching the actual complexity of life, what do you do to deal with that? And one fun question for Dr. Raman. I'm sitting beside Professor Upain, and he asked me to ask this question of you. Why did you kill the main character's husband on the very first page?
Usha predicted this.
I knew that this would be a question, but it's fiction. And it's not, okay, it's fiction. Okay. Yes. But just to very quickly respond to Anjali, I mean, I think all writers are extremely self critical, right? And so at some point, I mean, you do have to work at your craft and you do have to get it to a point where you know that it's as good. And I remember Anne Patchett saying this, that you will write, if it's not the best novel that that you could write, then you have to throw it out, even if you've written all 50 chapters of it. So you have to be willing to, as Didion says, kill your darlings, right?
So
I'll just
yeah.
add a line, if you don't mind. Going back to your question, I'll arc it to the question that you had about the interior voices. So the stories that I have, that I'd written, are very well summarized by a Stoic, Seneca II, and he says humans suffer more than in their heads than in reality.
That's a perfect ending, I would say.
There is so much to do and say. So I'm sure, can I volunteer you signing your own books? To get them signed. Nothing really to say except get the books, have them signed by the author. And there are many, many things actually that sort of like we want to ask questions about, but meet them afterwards. Thank you for a wonderful session and wonderful books.
Thank you so much, Usha, Jay, and Sita.